Welcome back to the SecurityPlus 701 preparation guide. We are now going to talk about third-party vendor risks, section 10. Third-party vendor risk refers to the cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities that can arise when organizations rely on external vendors, partners, or even service providers to handle certain key operations. Make sure that you're using your flashcards. There's a lot of terminology that's tested upon in the SecurityPlus, and I want to make sure that you are properly ready for the exam. When you're answering the questions on the exam, if you do not understand the terminology, it makes it that much harder to answer with the correct answer. All right. So as we said, it refers to the vulnerabilities and threats introduced through an organization's reliance on external suppliers, vendors, and service providers that can help contribute to the production, distribution, or maintenance of products and services. There are a lot of common attacks when we're dealing with third-party vendor risks. Just because we're dealing with an external entity means we're not in full control of what's happening. So we need to understand that there are certain attacks that can happen. They can have software supply chain attacks, and software supply chain attacks could happen when the software development process gets within a trusted vendor gets attacked or has unnecessary patches or compromised software in it. We'll talk a little bit about hardware supply chain attacks. This occurs when a hardware-based attack happens, like maybe the attackers tamper with physical components during the manufacturing process. We'll talk about third-party service attacks, talking about like MSPs, like a managed service provider, or other third party that has access to your critical systems. If anyone compromises these providers, the attackers then also may have access into your own systems. So why is it so effective? Well, it's because we trust them. We assume that since we're working with these vendors, they also are secure. They may have other services, but this trust allows attackers to bypass certain security procedures that we would rather not allow the attacker into our network. Things could also have widespread impact. So if they compromise one vendor, attackers may have impact multiple organizations simultaneously. This increases the reach of the threat actor. It's crazy that if they get into a managed service provider that may have over 3,000 clients, does the threat actor now have access to all 3,000 clients? And then we've got that they're hard to detect. Supply chain attacks can remain hidden for extended periods of time because too often does backdoor access via trusted systems make detection so much more difficult. Again, remember, we're dealing with trusted systems. Some of the more notable supply chain attacks that's happened recently, the last one that I can think of would be SolarWinds in 2020, where SolarWinds, threat actors came into SolarWinds and inserted malicious code within the SolarWinds Orion software update. They added a backdoor. Now attackers could have multiple backdoors within whomever installed the patch. The patch went out as a security patch to the organizations and then was installed. There was many government agencies and private companies who had backdoors installed within their systems. We can always remember the Target breach in 2013, where attackers compromised the HVAC of a vendor's network, utilizing the vendor's access to Target system, which allowed them to get credit card information. Now, there were other aspects of Target's security that let them do this, as in a flat network, but just because they came through the HVAC door allowed them to hit the point of sale registers at the same time. Well, how do we mitigate some of these supply chain attacks? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we understand vendor risk management. Vendor risk management means that we should conduct security assessments of all of our vendors suppliers, and partners before we engage in business. This means we're going to look at their cybersecurity posture. How do they handle their data? And how do they stay in compliance with different cybersecurity regulations? We would then look into contractual security requirements. This means we will put requirements on our vendors, ensuring that they adhere to the organization's security standards and practices. Well, if we're going to put requirements on our vendors, we need to make sure that we're monitoring them and auditing them. We need to make sure that these third-party systems have software updates and hardware components and make sure that they can detect if any suspicious activity is occurring. There's a lot of vulnerability scanning and threat intelligence that also can help with this, but we need to make sure that we're monitoring and holding our vendors accountable. We can start implementing a zero trust model where no system, user, or even vendor can be trusted to help prevent supply chain attacks. Implementing access controls and network segmentation will help us limit any damage that could occur from a compromised vendor. And then lastly, we need to make sure that our incident response plans are very robust. That includes procedures for responding to supply chain attacks. Not only are we looking at threat actors within our own organization or even external entities, we need to ensure that every PC that enters our door goes through a valid and rigorous test. Again, think of zero trust. So let's start with vendor assessments. It's kind of a generic term, but we need to evaluate the security posture of the third party before entering into the business relationship. Well, how do we do this? Well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the vendor and categorize their risks. What's the level of risk they pose with us doing business with them? We need to ensure that if they're handling sensitive information or providing critical services, or even having internal access to our own systems, that they are risked as a high risk, while others with minimal access could be risked as a low risk. Again, we're going to prioritize our vendors just like we do on our risk register, as we do with everything else in our environment. Next, we'll move on to a security questionnaire. A security questionnaire is a detailed questionnaire to the vendor to help us gather information about security practices. This is how we're going to identify how secure are they. We're going to look at data security measures. Think of encryption and access control. We're going to look at their network security. Do they have firewalls, intrusion detection systems? What is their incident response capabilities? Do they have a proper plan? Do they have a disaster recovery plan? What does their employee training and security awareness look like? Is it adequate? Could it be improved? What is compliance and regulation? Do they have vendor certifications? For instance, maybe they are GDPR or HIPAA or PCI. When does their audit occur? And what was the status of their last audit? For example, you might ask, what encryption methods do you use to protect sensitive data at rest and maybe even in transit? Describe your incident response process for managing data breaches. But remember, we're going to need to add some teeth. And what I mean by adding some teeth is we're going to be talking about service level agreements. And service level agreements, we need to ensure that all the requirements are clearly defined. in different service level agreements, otherwise known as SLA. We need to ensure that the commitments to maintaining security standards, data protection protocols, and compliance have specific outlined penalties or consequences. So if a vendor fails to meet these requirements, what do? We need to make sure that we're monitoring, right? And if we determine that it's not worth the risk, we may need to drop that vendor and move to a different vendor. We need to make sure that we're doing ongoing monitoring, because security assessments are not just a one-time activity. We need to continuously monitor their security posture. This could be on a schedule, maybe annually or quarterly, and we need to make sure that the vendor's performance is up to par. Maybe the first time they had an outage, they were able to respond in about an hour. But then the next time was 3 hours, and then it crept up to maybe 4 hours. Is their ongoing monitoring performance decreasing? And do we need to ask the vendor on making some improvements to their process? This is why we need to track any of the changes in the vendor's operations, because changes means risks, or at least could mean risks to our own environment. So how do we do a little bit more of this monitoring? Well, first thing we need to do is an ongoing risk assessment. So we need to make sure that the vendor's security practices are up to date, and if anything does change to their services or the system or internal processes, that we know about it and we can help take care of it. We need to monitor compliance and security policies. We need to ensure that the vendor continues to comply with our policies, our contractual obligations, and that may be that we review the vendor's compliance with data protection laws, encryption standards, or even incident response procedures. We need to conduct a regular security audit. We may need to come in ourselves on site and ensure that we review their access controls, their data handling practices, and their ability to respond. Make sure that they're not hiding anything. Automated monitoring tools could be used to make sure that we track everything, including anytime they have access to something. That way we can track for unauthorized access attempts, software vulnerabilities, or even malware detection. We need to make sure that we're tracking incident responses and breach notifications, and ensure that the vendors are following their own incident response protocols, because when a security event occurs, they need to be required to notify us promptly when it happens. And periodically, we probably should reevaluate the vendor's risk profile, because if there's changes that happen, we may need to up or lower their risk profile. Maybe we have additional information that they're handling for us, or maybe the vendor adopts new technology on how they store and handle data. And if necessary, we may need to terminate our vendor relationship, especially if they do not meet security standards. We don't want to put ourselves at risk, and so we may terminate the experience. And if repeat occurrences happen, we'll just find somebody else. Okay. So let's talk about contracts and agreements. This is one of the last sections of this group here. And contracts and agreements are between the organization and our third-party vendors. They're here to clearly define responsibilities, expectations, and even obligations, and normally related to security. These are legal documents. They do hold up in court. They make sure that they maintain certain security measures, complying with regulations, or outline how incidents should be responded if they occur. So the ones that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about an SLA, the service level agreement. We'll talk about the DPA, the data processing agreement, the NDA, which most of us probably know this one, the non-disclosure agreement, the MSA, the master service agreement, and then the MOU, the memorandum of understanding. So first is we have the SLA. The SLA is a contract that defines expectations and responsibilities of the vendor. And this is going to tell us what services they must provide, what level of security they must maintain. And there a lot of times there's performance metrics on here. There's a lot of key pieces here. For one, there's going to be the security controls. Like the vendor must implement such an encryption, access control, or even a vulnerability management software. We may say incident response, like a time frame in which the vendor must notify the organization of a breach and detail the steps that the vendor must take to contain or mitigate the incident. We may require the vendor to submit periodic audits and provide regular reports on some of their security practices. And lastly, we may want even performance metrics to ensure that the vendor services maintain a certain level of uptime and availability. Maybe our contract says 99.9% uptime for cloud services, because outages can also pose security risks. Let's talk about data processing agreement. The data processing agreement outlines on how vendors should handle, process, and store data on behalf of us, the organization. There are key pieces to this puzzle. One is the data ownership, to make sure that the organization retains ownership of all data. And even if the vendor is only processing the data for the organization, we need to make sure that our data has specific measures in place to protect it. Maybe data encryption, maybe tokenizing, maybe even access controls. We need to know that, hey, if there is a breach, that we know about it. For instance, GDPR has a 72-hour notification. And then we need to have deletion and retention. How long is our data retained? Under what conditions must it be deleted? This is under the contract. And then lastly, data sovereignty. As we know, our data, if it goes through other countries, may be under control of those other countries. Well, if we do not want to do business in another country, how do they ensure that our data never leaves maybe U.S. soil? Let's talk about non-disclosure agreements. An NDA is a legal contract that ensures sensitive information shared between the party and the vendor remains confidential. They really protect proprietary information. These are there to protect trade secrets, intellectual property, and any other types of data that could cause us harm if exposed. So we must clearly define what constitutes confidential information with our vendor. This could be on both of the business's data and even the security practices. This just ensures that it's a clear black and white line of what is right and what is wrong. We're going to talk about the obligations of confidentiality. How should the vendor handle confidential information? What is the restrictions on sharing, copying, or even disclosing any of that data to third parties? Because we may have an NDA with the company, and they may have an NDA with another company, but we do not have an NDA with that other company. They should not share our information without our express approval. We need to make sure what that duration of confidentiality is. So how long does this stay as a confidential system? And if there is a breach, what are the consequences? Now, I find that many NDAs don't follow this, and they should, because this should hold up in the court of law. Just making you sign an NDA without the meats and the guts and knowing, hey, what are the definitions, obligations, the durations, and the penalties, makes it very hard to enforce within court. Now let's talk about the Master Service Agreement. An MSA is a broader version of the contract, okay? This is something we use between the organization and the vendor, And it's just a foundation. It's the beginning of the relationship. It normally provides basic security performance and then intellectual property and even dispute resolutions. Most of the time, an arbitrator, some kind of mitigation. It may say we need to implement certain levels of security controls for certain policies or regulatory bodies. It may say that we need to that we're required to follow HIPAA or PCI or GDPR. It may define the vendor's liability in case there is a security breach, such as indemnification. And this is to help protect us from any financial losses resulting in the vendor's failure to meet security requirements. And then, as always, there should be a termination clause. Under which condition should the contract be able to be terminated if the vendor fails to meet their obligations, specifically when it's dealing with security incidents or breach of contract? So this is the end of this subject. If you're in the in-class version of this class in person, we will split up into two different groups. We're going to have a team 1 and a team 2. Team 1 will be our customer organization. They're going to be responsible for accessing all our vendor security and maintaining data protection. And they're also going to respond to the security incident. Now, the vendor, on the other hand, is going to help provide cloud services to the organization, giving us access to certain systems and sensitive customer information. If you're in class, I'll continue on with this scenario, and afterwards we'll do a Kahoot. Hopefully this is helpful. Remember, in this section of CompTIA's SecurityPlus, they really want you to understand third-party vendor risks and what kind of things do we need to do to include supply chain risks between software, hardware, and third-party attacks. Why do they happen? How do we protect against it, including using the vendor assessment and looking at how do we categorize our vendors? How do we give them the security questionnaire, certification and compliance, on-site assessments and audits, data handling access controls, and ongoing information. And then how do we hold their feet to the fire? What are the legal documentation, such as NDA, MSA, SLA, and how is it used to ensure compliance? And what is the teeth? What are the penalties that comes with it? Hopefully this is helpful. I'll see you in the next segment. Remember to review those flashcards.